Deilihagkerfið á Point Zero 22. apríl í Gamla bíó.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure being here this morning, discussing about the future of business from the perspective of platforms and how digital technologies enable us to move to a new kind of future. And I've always been very fascinated by thinking about the future, whether it's in terms of how business models are changing, or whether it's just the Isaac Asimov science fiction kind of thinking about the future, if you will. Because the future is something that excites all of us. And one of my favorite movies while growing up back in the 80s as a kid was this movie called Back to the Future. How many of you have seen this movie before? Great. So then this analogy does not come totally out of context. So this is a movie where the characters get into a car and speed off in that car and sort of fly off into the future. And the future that they fly off into is actually happening 6 months from today. This is the dashboard from the car in the movie, and the future that they fly off into is October 21st, 2015, exactly 6 months from today. So according to this movie, the future is already here. We are already in the future. The tragedy, though, is that we don't have those flying cars yet that this movie talks about. And Peter Thiel, when he started the Founders Fund, probably shared my frustration with this, because the Founders Fund manifesto is this: we wanted flying cars, but all we got were 140 characters. That's the kind of future we ended up in. But I want to talk a bit today about an alternate future that does not have flying cars, because the future that we always thought of did not quite turn out the way we thought it would turn out. But I want to weave a narrative and paint a few pictures about the future where I believe that 140 characters are actually way more transformative than flying cars would ever be. And to do that, I want to start with this quote that I read in TechCrunch last month that did the rounds of the internet a lot. This is a quote that perfectly encapsulates everything that seems to be going wrong with the world today. So this says that in 2015, the world's largest taxi company doesn't own taxis, the world's largest retailer doesn't own any inventory or stores, the world's largest accommodation provider doesn't own rooms, and, well, the world's largest media company doesn't own the media that it's monetizing. So nobody seems to own anything, and everybody seems to be rushing to multi-billion-dollar valuations in a really short period of time. And that's, unfortunately, or that's how a lot of people would think, that that's the unfortunate future that we are headed towards. But I want to talk a bit about why this future is actually a really good outcome of a range of shifts that are happening in the economy at this point in time. So instead of flying cars, I want to use 3 different pictures that I think of as a right representation of the kind of future we are moving towards. The first picture that gives us an indication of the future that we are moving towards is this picture that you've probably seen at some point in time over the last couple of years since it started moving around the internet. It's a picture that shows the same place, the Vatican, at the papal ceremony in 2005 and 2013. And it shows the difference that the world has gone through during that short period of time. To me, the difference is as follows. In 2005, the internet was something that we used to do sitting at a desk and staring at a monitor. In 2013, the internet was something that we're always connected to. And that's a fundamental difference in how we can create entirely new ecosystems of producers producing and becoming part of the internet and accessing a new market all the time. Incidentally, 2005 is when Nokia and BlackBerry used to lead the market, and 2013 they had already lost 95% of their market share. And this picture sort of shows why that happened, because the smartphone revolution changed the way we connected. And so the first shift that I believe is happening today is this democratization of access. Traditionally, access has never been democratized. You needed to know the right people. You needed to rub shoulders with the right kinds of guys to get access. But we're now in a world where access is increasingly being democratized. We were having discussions yesterday where we were talking about societies where people do not have access to sanitation, people do not have access to drinking water, but they have access to connectivity to the internet. The second shift that's happening in the world today is something that's a bit more complex to explain. And so I'll use a slide that is fairly complex, but it shows exactly what's happening in the world today that is fundamentally changing the way the world works. And this is probably something you've seen before. We might call this the selfie generation, but this shows the shift that is happening in the world today. And the shift is that we are in a period of maximum production. We've never produced so much. There's a reason why we've always been called couch potatoes, because our job was just to be a consumer. And I know that Jerry is talking right after this, and he hates this word consumer. So we've fundamentally moved away from being consumer only to a society where now we are producers as well. We are producing value all the time. And this is being enabled because new forms of technologies are being created that allow everyone to produce. The smartphone was one such technology. Adobe's Creative Suite was another such technology that democratized production of graphic design. 3D printers are another form of technology that are democratizing manufacturing at this moment. And so one of the truths of our time right now is what we see in this picture, the democratization of production. Which, if you think of it, the democratization of production complemented with the democratization of access completely reconfigures markets, because now anyone can produce and reach out to a market whenever they want to. The third picture that I want to talk about is this, and we may not be in a future that has flying cars, but we are in a future that has thinking thermostats. And I believe that thinking thermostats are going to be much more useful to our future than flying cars would have been. If you think of what Nest does, Nest is a thinking thermostat. It absorbs data from its environment, it learns from the data and teaches itself how to behave in the future, but it's also connected to all the other thermostats that are around in that city, and it learns from all of their behaviors. And together, all of the data collected from all of these thermostats provides intelligence to the city utilities board about how power is being consumed in the city. So the fact that I'm trying to point out over here is that traditionally, we've lived in a world where computing and intelligence was the prerogative of a computer. You called something a computer because it could compute and it was intelligent. But what we're seeing today is that every machine, everything, every object out there can be a computer because it's always connected to the cloud, and using sensors, it can learn and improve itself over time. So we're seeing a democratization of intelligence. All kinds of things are being connected to the internet. And it's a combination of these three shifts, the democratization of access, of production, and of intelligence, that together lead us to a huge shift in the economy that we are seeing at this point in time. And that's what I want to spend the next 10 to 12 minutes talking about. If I were to talk about a shift in the economy that's happening today, I would have to contrast it against what used to be the norm before this shift happened. So the way I think of the world before these three shifts started happening was that the world used to work in the form of pipes. Design of business was linear. They were the producer at one end, a consumer at the other end, and the job of the producer was just to keep creating stuff, pushing it out to consumers, and the job of the consumer was just to consume. There was absolutely no feedback, no real-time feedback. There was absolutely no participation on the part of the consumer, and the goal of the producer was just to keep convincing the consumer to consume more. That's what the pipe world used to look like, and that's the world we inherited because of the industrial era. Because whenever you need to create value, the reason for this is very simple. Whenever you need to create value, you need to ensure that a lot of processes and resources are aligned together for value creation. And the only way to align all of those processes and resources traditionally was in large companies by bringing all of these people together, bringing all the resources together, managing them using hierarchies, and ensuring that value is created. But because of the democratization of access, the democratization of production, and the democratization of intelligence, value can now be created and delivered from anywhere to anybody, and that's why we're seeing an entirely new design of business fundamentally. It's an entirely new shape of business, which is no longer this linear business model. The shape of business that we're seeing today is what I think of as platforms, and I know that platforms are a hugely contested word. Everybody seems to be building one. Half the people don't know what they mean by platforms. Half the other people think they're building platforms as well, but they mean something else. So let me propose my own definition of what I mean by a platform. If we were to think of two of the companies that we think of as platform companies today, things that we carry in our pockets, smartphones, we attribute it to the Android or the iOS platform. We call them platforms for a certain reason. If we look at the design of this business, it's fundamentally different from this linear pipe business. It's not a pipe anymore, as you can see. The business now is an infrastructure on which external developers can come in and build apps, and it creates the conditions that enable the developers to find a market and the market to find the right apps. And people always get the technology part because they think the platform is about technology, but a platform is largely about governance and about deciding what should be opened out for external innovation and what should not. So what I want to point out over here is that the platform's role is fundamentally twofold. It needs to act as an infrastructure, and it needs to govern the interactions for an external market. And that's what Apple and Android did to this when they built out the smartphone. Now, if we look at this design of business, we see this happening increasingly around us every day. It's not just something that is restricted to the Apples or the Androids of the world. If we think of Airbnb, Airbnb provides an infrastructure that allows hosts to create availability of their rooms on top of it, and it governs the interactions that allows travelers and hosts to interact with each other in a way that the two sides can trust each other. So it decides all the market signaling mechanisms, all the trust mechanisms that need to be there for the interactions to happen. Airbnb is not powerful because it makes great technology. It's powerful because it can govern these interactions in a scalable manner over the period of time. And a third example, if you will, and I could keep on going with more and more examples, everything that's happening in crowdsourcing, 3D printing, Bitcoin, the sharing economy, social media, everything that we see around us today are all implications that are happening because of platforms. So Amazon is, again, a great example of a platform re-intermediating a pipe. We often use this word disintermediation as if the new entity is a very benevolent, nice guy who's not intermediating anymore. But to me, it's a scalable re-intermediation. We still have an intermediary, it's just somebody who's a lot more scalable. So if I were to summarize this, the design of business that we see with platforms is the following, that the business acts as an infrastructure on top of which producers and consumers of value come together and interact with each other. And they exchange value on top of the platform. What you would note here is that there is nobody who's a producer or a consumer only. The same person can run a hotel on Airbnb and can be a traveler on Airbnb as well. But what's important is that these are two distinct roles. Everybody can participate in both of these roles because of the way production has become democratized. And this is a shift that's not happening purely in a few industries. This is a shift that's happening across industries. If we just take a look at these three examples that I just mentioned, we'll note that platforms always end up disrupting pipes. We keep hearing this word disruption a lot, to the point that a lot of us do not even know what disruption technically really means. So I want to lay out a very simplistic version of how disruption plays out. The way I see disruption playing is that platforms always disrupt pipes because of a few reasons. Think of what happened with the Nokia, with the handset manufacturing or the telco industry. It used to work as a pipe where the handset manufacturer or the telecom carrier would source applications, preload all of them, and then put it out into the market. Apple and Android completely changed that with the platform model, where they just created an infrastructure on which anybody could come in and create applications and reach a market. Hotels have always worked in a very linear fashion. If a hotel has to expand, it has to build new locations, it has to create more rooms, and then it has to actually maintain those rooms on an ongoing basis. Airbnb expands with near zero marginal cost of expansion because it can sign up hosts at will as long as it can find them travelers on a regular basis. And that's the power of the platform that Airbnb leverages. Traditional publishing has always had a very non-scalable gatekeeper sitting in the middle, an editor who would decide what should go out to the market and what the market wanted, whereas now Amazon is a much more scalable re-intermediary who does not decide what the market wants based on what it thinks is best, but based on actual market feedback in the form of votes, ratings, any form of social feedback. So we see this shift happening from pipe-based models to platform-based models repeatedly. And if your industry is an industry that is working like a pipe today, there are ripe opportunities for it to be disrupted by a platform model. Let me talk about specific ways and specific issues that creep up in industries that allow platforms to come in and completely change the way the industry works. So there are 4 repeated narratives in disruption. Across all industries, we see 4 things happening repeatedly, and there's a reason those 4 things happen because of the first 3 shifts that I talked about at the beginning of this discussion. The first thing that's happening across industries at this point in time is that platforms are removing inefficient gatekeepers. There are a lot of industries today that have inefficient gatekeepers. Publishing was one of those industries, music, another such industry. I'm sorry, but banking is one such industry, and education is one such industry. In a lot of these industries, platforms are coming in and removing inefficient gatekeepers. The only difference between the disrupted and the to be disrupted is that the cost of participating in a transaction in banking is that much higher than a cost of participating in a faulty transaction in media. You could see a wrong movie on YouTube, or you could end up seeing something irrelevant and you wouldn't mind. But if you end up loaning your money to somebody who defaults, you would really mind that. And that's the only thing that is saving certain industries from being disrupted by platforms. The second thing that platforms do very often is that platforms unlock entirely new sources of value. And this is very important because a lot of people complain that all that platforms are doing is changing the old guard and taking the new guard. But platforms do something fundamentally different. This is a tweet from Brian Chesky where he says that Marriott would take a whole year to add a certain number of rooms, and Airbnb could do that in a matter of days. And that's because platforms do not just find existing inventory. They create inventory out of thin air. What I mean by that is because of Airbnb, there's a whole economy of hosts who have come up who would never have thought of lending out their homes as accommodation to travelers. So platforms allow entire new sources of value creation, and this is extremely powerful because it is because of these new sources of value creation that traditional industries get disrupted. Amazon allows people who would not have thought of writing a book to start writing, and it's because of that, because there's strength in numbers from non-traditional sources of value, that the traditional sources of value get disrupted. The third narrative in platform-based disruption that we see very often is that platforms take a highly inefficient and disaggregated market, fragmented market, and then they aggregate all of it and make it very efficient. A classic example of that is what happened to the hotel industry and the restaurant industry because of TripAdvisor and Yelp. Before TripAdvisor and Yelp, the way you would find a restaurant or a hotel was you would either ask your friend or you'd end up finding some expert whose review you would trust without knowing whether that review was actually useful for you. What TripAdvisor and Yelp do is they create a layer of reputation on top of an extremely fragmented industry. And that helps new consumers take decisions in a much more efficient manner. The fourth way platforms disrupt industries is extremely unique. It's something that's happened in a very small set of industries right now, but I believe that it's going to happen increasingly in a lot of industries going forward, and in a lot of industries that do not think they will be disrupted by platforms. The fourth way that platforms change things is by reconfiguring an entire supply chain onto a platform. Think of what Wikipedia does. The traditional way of building an encyclopedia is a supply chain. You have people sourcing content, you have people editing that content, you have people deciding what kind of content is good to put inside a big encyclopedia, and then you have people distributing those encyclopedias. And Wikipedia takes this whole linear supply chain, breaks it down, and puts it onto a platform where all of these things do not flow in a straight line, and yet the whole organism works. And I believe that this is something that's going to happen increasingly in other industries, especially as 3D printing comes in place as well. Because one of the things that is preventing manufacturing from moving from a straight line model is because the cost of manufacturing has traditionally been too high. Whereas the cost of editing on Wikipedia was very low. But with 3D printers, we're probably reaching a place where that cost of additional marginal manufacturing is going to go down as well. So those are the four broad themes that I see repeatedly happening across industries and that I wanted to share as key themes that accompany platform-based disruption. Now, I want to talk about building platforms very quickly, and I want to make this quick because this is something that I spend a lot of time advising companies on, and this is not something that can be covered in 5 minutes. So I'm going to give you a 5-minute version of what is important in building platforms. If I had to say just 2 or 3 things, this would be the set of things that I would want all of you to leave with if you're building platforms. The first thing, and the single most important thing while building platforms, is to know that you do not start with the technology. And this is where a lot of companies get this wrong. We know that Twitter started with the technology for writing 140 characters, and nobody knew what to do with it. But if we want to go about hoping that we get as lucky as them, that's not really going to be a strategy. The way you build platforms is that instead of focusing on the technology, you start with the interaction you're enabling. Define the interaction, lay out who is the producer, who's the consumer, what do they look like, what are they exchanging, what kind of value is the producer producing, what are the barriers to producing that value, and how can you remove those barriers, what are the attendant technologies that are happening right now that enable you to remove those barriers, and what does the consumer give the producer back that encourages them to keep producing more often. And only after you have this interaction laid out should you move towards creating the actual technology that enables these interactions. Because the platform, as we mentioned, is the infrastructure on which these interactions happen. To do this, a platform business should do exactly three things really well. And this is something that I really live by, because every time you're thinking of building a platform and you're saying, hey, that sounds like a good idea, let's do that. And you come up with a new feature and you say, hey, that sounds like a good bell and whistle, let's just put that in. You need to think through, how is this new addition helping us execute on these 3 priorities for a platform business? The 3 things that a platform needs to do really well is, first of all, it needs to create pull. This is a bit more intricate than just thinking of it as marketing, because platforms are very complex for a specific reason. The day Airbnb or Uber launches, it does not have any taxis or any accommodation. So there's no value, there are no producers, and there's no reason for consumers to come. And when consumers are not coming, producers won't come anyway. So platforms always have a chicken and egg problem. So starting that pull at a time when you have a chicken and egg problem is incredibly complex, and that's one of the key things that platforms need to focus on. But equally important is the fact that you can never let go of the pull when you're moving on forward. So what platforms need to also do is, even after you solve the chicken and egg problem, you need to ensure that you create new behaviors that make producers and consumers stick to you as often as possible. Think of it, you download probably 100 apps onto your mobile phone. You use probably 30 of them more than once, but you use probably only 4 or 5 of them on a daily basis. And that is an app that has been successful in creating a behavior for you to keep coming back and producing, or keep coming back and consuming. So if you're building a platform, you need to ensure that whoever your producer or consumer is, you create the right behaviors that encourage them to keep coming back on a regular basis. The second thing that's very important when building a platform is that the platform should facilitate interactions. And very often we think that this is just about technology, create the right technologies, and people will use it. But facilitation is a lot more about governance. What kinds of interactions should be encouraged? What kind of interactions should be discouraged? What happens if a lady meets a murderer on a dating site? Is that something that you'd like to encourage? No. So how do you discover who's going to murder somebody before they want to do that? That's the kind of facilitation that platforms need to do. I'm obviously going on a hyperbolic trajectory over there, but what I'm trying to say is that platforms need to use data, need to use different forms of curation mechanisms to figure out what kinds of interactions are going to be desirable and which ones are going to be undesirable. The final thing that platforms need to do, and need to do as they scale, is that they need to continue matching well, because the problem with platforms is there are a lot of good things about succeeding with the platform. The problem with succeeding with a platform is that you have the problem of abundance. Once you have too many people creating too many things, consumers find it difficult to find the right thing. If you think of what's happening on the Apple App Store right now, everybody ends up using the same apps because it's just too difficult finding the right apps, because Apple has not figured out the matching solution to the matching problem really well. And this is a problem that all platforms need to end up facing when they have abundance. So you need to ensure that you're collecting data on an ongoing basis that allows you to match producers and consumers in a sustainable manner, and consumers and whatever products are created on the platform in a sustainable manner. And an easy way to think of all of this is to just line it up as pull, facilitate, match, the 3 things that make a platform stand and make it work perfectly. I want to end this on this note, and I want to leave all of you with this one key thought, that traditionally and always, we've always thought that we're in the business of building products and services. But because of the shifts that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, and because of everything that I've shared in terms of the shift from pipes to platforms, I believe that increasingly, all of us will be in the business of enabling interactions. Thank you so much.